The clock on the wall read 10:15 p.m. I was alone in the office, the fluorescent lights humming above me. As I finished typing the operational report due the next morning, my fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, eager to complete the work and return to my quarters for some much-needed rest. "Still here, Lieutenant?" The voice startled me. I looked up to see Major Richard Morrison standing in the doorway. It was unusual for him to be in the office this late. He was my superior officer, responsible for overseeing our unit's operations, and generally kept regular hours. "Yes, sir," I replied, straightening in my chair. "Just finishing tomorrow's briefing report." He walked slowly toward my desk, his footsteps deliberate. Something felt different about his demeanor tonight. There was a casualness to his movements. That made me uneasy, a departure from his usual professional distance. "Let me take a look at that," he said, moving behind my chair to peer over my shoulder at the computer screen. He stood too close. I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. Every instinct told me this was wrong, but he was my commanding officer. I told myself I was being oversensitive, that this was just a senior officer reviewing a subordinate's work. "This section needs revision," he said, his hand landing on my shoulder. "It's late. Why don't I help you with it?" Before I could respond, he pulled up a chair beside me, not across the desk where protocol would suggest, but right next to mine, our chairs nearly touching. His eyes held something I couldn't quite define. It wasn't professional interest. It was something else entirely. "Thank you, sir, but I can handle it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. His hand returned to my shoulder, then slowly moved down my back. My heart began to race. This wasn't mentorship or assistance. This was completely inappropriate. "Lieutenant, you're very talented," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I can help advance your career. I have connections." His hand remained on my lower back. There was no mistaking his intentions now. My mind flashed to my academy mentor, Sarah Williams, and the advice she'd given me years ago. Never compromise your integrity for anyone's approval. I took a deep breath, gathered my courage, and spoke firmly. "Sir, that's inappropriate contact. Please remove your hand." My voice didn't waver. I surprised myself with my own clarity. His hand paused. "What did you say?" "Your behavior constitutes sexual harassment under Military Code of Conduct," I said, standing up and stepping back from the desk. "It needs to stop immediately." The distance between us felt crucial. My heart pounded, but my resolve was clear. Major Morrison's face hardened, a flash of anger, crossing his features before he masked it with feigned innocence. "Lieutenant, I think you're misunderstanding. I was simply offering guidance. With respect, sir, we both know that's not true." A heavy silence filled the office. He stared at me, perhaps, expecting me to back down, to apologize, to doubt myself. When I held his gaze, he looked away first. "Fine," he said curtly, standing. "Finish your report. We'll discuss this tomorrow." He walked out, and the moment the door closed, my legs nearly gave out. I sank into my chair, my hands shaking. Had I done the right thing? Was I overreacting? No. I knew better. That was harassment, clear and simple. And just like what happened to Sarah. Sarah Williams had been my mentor at the military academy. She was the reason I'd learned to stand on my own merit, rather than rely on my family connections. But Sarah had faced similar harassment from a superior officer at her first duty station. When she reported it, nothing happened. The system protected the perpetrator. 3 months later, Sarah took her own life. I'd promised myself then that if I ever faced such a situation, I would fight back not just for myself, but for Sarah and every service member who'd been silenced. As I packed up my things that night, I knew this was only the beginning. Major Morrison wouldn't let this go. Men like him never did. But I also knew I wouldn't back down. The walk back to my quarters felt longer than usual. The base was quiet, most personnel already asleep. I thought about calling my father, but immediately dismissed the idea. He was a two-star general, yes, but I'd worked hard to build my career without trading on his name. I'd even kept our relationship confidential, using my mother's maiden name professionally. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I kept replaying the encounter, wondering what would happen next, knowing that challenging a superior officer's misconduct often led to retaliation. I was right to worry. The next morning, I arrived at 6 a.m. for our daily briefing. The atmosphere in the office had changed. My fellow officers, people I'd worked alongside for 8 months, suddenly avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. "Lieutenant, my office." "Now." Major Morrison's voice carried across the room. I followed him into his office, maintaining my composure. He closed the door and turned to face me with an expression of cold fury, barely concealed beneath a professional veneer. "About last night's report," he began. "It's completely inadequate. Redo the entire thing. Also, I'm assigning you the logistics analysis that was due last week. Should have been someone else's project, but I need someone detail-oriented. You'll have both on my desk by 8 a.m. tomorrow." The logistics analysis was a 40-hour project minimum, combined with redoing the report I'd already completed. It was impossible to finish in one day. "Sir, the report met all the specified requirements. Are you questioning my judgment, Lieutenant?" "No, sir. I'm simply noting that the report was approved by—" "Then get it done." Dismissed. This was the beginning of what I would later recognize as a systematic campaign of workplace retaliation. Over the following weeks, the assignments multiplied. Impossible deadlines. Tasks assigned at 5 p.m., due the next morning. Work that was approved one day, rejected the next with no explanation. My performance reviews, which had been exemplary, suddenly noted concerns about attention to detail and questions about leadership potential. During a staff meeting 2 weeks later, Major Morrison presented training evaluation results to the entire command group. When he reached my unit's performance data, he paused deliberately. "As you can see, 3rd Platoon's performance has been notably deficient." He displayed a chart highlighting below-average scores. "Perhaps this demonstrates why certain diversity initiatives don't translate to operational effectiveness." The implication was clear. Several officers shifted uncomfortably. A few smirked. My face burned with humiliation, but I kept my expression neutral. After the meeting, I tried to speak with Lieutenant James Patterson, someone I'd considered a friend. "Jim, can I talk to you about—" "Sorry, really busy right now," he said, walking quickly past me. It wasn't subtle. Major Morrison was isolating me professionally, and it was working. People feared association with me might damage their own careers. The only person who showed any support was Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, a veteran NCO with 20 years of service. One evening, as I worked late again, she stopped by my desk. "Lieutenant, you need to be careful," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure we were alone. "Major Morrison has been talking to the other officers. He's making sure everyone keeps their distance from you." "I appreciate the warning, Sergeant." "There's something else." She hesitated. "He's done this before. At his last duty station. I have a friend who served with him there. A female captain reported him for inappropriate conduct. Her career was destroyed. She was forced out within 6 months. My blood ran cold. This was a pattern. Did she have evidence? She did. But his father-in-law is Colonel Bradley Thompson, the garrison commander at that base. The complaint disappeared. Colonel Thompson. I recognized the name. He was well connected, on track for brigadier general. Major Morrison had married into military royalty, which gave him a layer of protection most officers didn't have. Thank you for telling me, Sergeant Rodriguez. Just watch your back, ma'am, and document everything. I was already planning to do exactly that. If you're finding this story meaningful, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories that matter. Now, let's continue. 3 weeks into the retaliation, I developed a system. Every assignment, every deadline, every interaction, I documented it all. Dates, times, witnesses when available. I saved every email, kept copies of every revised report, tracked every impossible deadline. But I needed more than documentation of workplace harassment. I needed evidence of the original offense. The opportunity came sooner than expected. It was another late evening, another deliberately impossible deadline. The office was empty except for me, working under the harsh fluorescent lights. I heard the door open and knew, even before looking up, who it would be. "Working late again, Lieutenant?" Major Morrison's voice carried that same casual tone from our first encounter. "Yes, sir. The strategic assessment you assigned is due tomorrow morning." He walked toward my desk with that same deliberate slowness. This time I was ready. Earlier that day, I'd purchased a small digital recorder, no bigger than a USB drive. It was in my uniform pocket, already activated. "You know," he said, standing too close again, "this doesn't have to be so difficult. You're making your own life hard." "I'm just trying to do my job, sir." "Your job?" He laughed without humor. "Your job is what I say it is. And right now you're failing at it. Your performance reports reflect that." His hand reached out and touched my shoulder, just as it had before. I didn't move away immediately. I needed him to speak clearly, to state his intentions explicitly. "It could be different," he continued, his voice dropping. "I can change those reports. I can recommend you for advanced training, better assignments. All you need to do is be more cooperative." "Cooperative in what way, sir?" I kept my voice neutral, letting him incriminate himself. "Don't play naive. You know exactly what I mean." His hand moved from my shoulder down my arm. "We could have a mutually beneficial relationship. I take care of you. You're grateful. Simple. Sir, you're describing a quid pro quo sexual relationship in exchange for favorable treatment. That's illegal under the Uniform Code of Military Justice." His expression changed instantly, from predatory confidence to cold anger. "You're recording this, aren't you?" He grabbed my wrist. "Give me your phone." "I don't have my phone, sir." "You're lying." He released my wrist and reached for my pocket, but I stepped back quickly. "Sir, you need to leave. This conversation is over. You have no idea who you're dealing with," he said, his voice now openly threatening. "Colonel Thompson is my father-in-law. Do you understand what that means? Any complaint you file goes through him. Any investigation needs his approval. You're a lieutenant. You have no power here." "I have the truth, sir. And I have evidence." "Evidence?" He laughed harshly. "You think anyone will believe you over me? I'm a decorated officer with 15 years of service. You're a junior officer with a failing performance record, a record I created. Who do you think they'll believe?" He moved toward me again, and I backed toward the door. "This is your last chance," he said. "Forget this happened. Delete whatever recording you think you have. Keep your head down and accept that this is how the world works, or I destroy your career. It's that simple. My career isn't worth my integrity, sir. Then you're a fool. He stormed out, leaving me shaking but resolute. I had what I needed. His own words, his admission of retaliation, his explicit threats all recorded. But Sergeant Rodriguez's warning echoed in my mind. The previous victim had evidence too, and it hadn't mattered. Major Morrison's father-in-law had made sure of that. I needed something more. I needed someone with enough authority to ensure the evidence wouldn't be buried. The next morning, I learned that the base was getting a new commanding general. Major General William Parker was transferring in from the Pentagon, set to take command in 2 weeks. I didn't know much about him, except that he had a reputation as a strict disciplinarian who enforced regulations without favoritism. It seemed like a potential opportunity, but I couldn't be certain. I'd never met General Parker. I had no way to know if he would listen or if he'd simply defer to Colonel Thompson's influence. Meanwhile, Major Morrison escalated his campaign. During physical training one morning, he loudly criticized my performance in front of the entire company. "Lieutenant, is that the best you can do? In my day, we expected officers to meet higher standards, particularly those who want to be taken seriously. It was a public humiliation designed to undermine my credibility. Some soldiers looked uncomfortable. Others simply stared at their shoes, unwilling to witness my degradation. After PT, Captain Michelle Sanders approached me in the locker room. She was one of the few female officers in our battalion, someone I'd hoped might be an ally. "You should consider requesting a transfer," she said quietly. "This situation isn't going to improve. I shouldn't have to transfer because I refused harassment. I agree. But sometimes pragmatism matters more than principles." She looked genuinely sympathetic. "I've been in the military for 12 years. I've seen how these situations end. The system protects senior officers. It always has. Then the system needs to change. Maybe, but you can't change it by yourself, and you'll destroy your career trying." She meant well, I knew that, but her advice represented everything I was fighting against: the accepted wisdom that victims should quietly disappear rather than hold perpetrators accountable. That evening, I sat in my quarters and made a decision. I would wait for General Parker's arrival and approach him directly with the evidence. It was a risk. If he sided with Morrison and Thompson, my career would indeed be over. But it was the only path I could see that might lead to actual accountability. In the meantime, I continued documenting everything. Major Morrison seemed to believe his threats had worked, that I'd been sufficiently intimidated. He maintained the hostile work environment, but stopped the overt harassment, apparently confident that the message had been received. What he didn't know was that I was using this time to build an even stronger case. I discreetly contacted a military lawyer through the Legal Assistance Office, not to file a formal complaint yet, but to understand the proper procedures and ensure my evidence would meet legal standards. The lawyer, Captain David Foster, reviewed my documentation during a confidential consultation. "This is thorough," he said, clearly impressed. "The recording is particularly damaging. But I need to be honest with you, Lieutenant. Cases like this are difficult to win, especially when the accused has powerful connections. What would you advise? Officially, I have to advise you to follow the chain of command report to your superior officer, which in this case would be Colonel Thompson, who is Major Morrison's father-in-law." "Exactly. Which is why, unofficially, I'd suggest waiting for the new commanding general. General Parker has a reputation for integrity. If you can get this evidence to him directly, you might have a chance. And if I can't, Captain Foster was quiet for a moment. Then you'll need to decide whether this fight is worth the personal cost. Because it will be costly, even if you win. I understood what he meant. Even with justice served, I would forever be known as that officer who filed a complaint. Some would admire my courage. Others would see me as a troublemaker who couldn't handle military culture. My career would be defined by this incident. But I thought about Sarah Williams, my mentor, who'd taken her own life when the system failed her. I thought about the captain at Major Morrison's previous assignment, whose career had been destroyed. I thought about all the service members, past and future, who would face similar situations. Sometimes the cost of silence was higher than the cost of speaking. 2 weeks later, General Parker arrived. The change of command ceremony was held on a crisp autumn morning. The entire base assembled on the parade ground, uniforms immaculate, formations precise. I stood with my unit, watching as Major General William Parker officially assumed command. He was an imposing figure, tall, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent 3 decades in uniform. His speech was brief and direct, emphasizing accountability, integrity, and adherence to military values. I expect every member of this command to uphold the highest standards, he said, his voice carrying across the parade ground. That expectation applies equally to everyone, regardless of rank or position. There will be no exceptions. As he spoke, I made my decision. I would approach him as soon as appropriate protocol allowed. That opportunity came sooner than expected. 2 days after taking command, General Parker held an open office hour, a time when any soldier could request to speak with him directly. It was an old military tradition that many senior officers honored more in theory than practice. But General Parker's reputation suggested he took it seriously. I submitted a formal request through the proper channels, stating that I needed to discuss a sensitive matter of military justice. The response came back within hours. I had an appointment for the following morning at 9 a.m. That night, I barely slept. I reviewed my evidence, organized my documentation, and rehearsed what I would say. This was my one chance. If General Parker dismissed my complaint or referred it back through the chain of command, I'd have no recourse. The next morning, I arrived at division headquarters 15 minutes early. General Parker's aide, a major with a professional demeanor, directed me to wait in the anteroom. At precisely 9 a.m., the door opened. "Lieutenant, the general will see you now." I entered the office, came to attention, and rendered a crisp salute. General Parker returned it and gestured to a chair. "At ease, Lieutenant. Please sit down." His office was Spartan, few personal items, military maps on the walls, a desk that appeared well used but organized. This was clearly the workspace of someone focused on function over appearance. "You requested this meeting to discuss a sensitive matter," he said. "I'm listening." I took a deep breath and began. I told him everything: the initial harassment, my refusal, the systematic retaliation that followed. I explained Major Morrison's connections to Colonel Thompson and how that relationship had protected him in the past. I presented the documentation I'd compiled: assignment logs, showing impossible deadlines, emails with contradictory guidance, performance reports that conflicted with objective metrics. And finally, I played the recording. General Parker's expression remained neutral throughout, but I noticed his jaw tighten as he listened to Major Morrison's explicit threats and admissions. When the recording ended, he was silent for a long moment. "This is a serious allegation," he finally said. "You understand that making a false accusation against a superior officer is itself a punishable offense?" "Yes, sir. I understand." Everything I've told you is true. Why didn't you report this through your chain of command? Sir, Colonel Thompson is Major Morrison's father-in-law. At Major Morrison's previous duty station, a female officer filed a similar complaint. It was buried, and her career was destroyed. I didn't believe the chain of command would be impartial in this case. General Parker leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in thought. That's a serious allegation against Colonel Thompson as well. I'm not alleging that Colonel Thompson has done anything improper at this command, sir. I'm simply explaining why I didn't believe the standard reporting procedures would result in a fair investigation. He studied me carefully. Lieutenant, what's your father's name? The question surprised me. Sir, I don't see how that's relevant. Humor me. My father is Major General James Hartley, sir, but I serve under my mother's maiden name. I've worked hard to build my career on my own merit, not through family connections. Understanding dawned in his eyes. James Hartley. We served together in Afghanistan. Good officer. Does he know about this situation? No, sir. I haven't told him. Why not? He could have intervened. With respect, sir, that's exactly why I didn't tell him. If my father intervened, it would validate everything I've been trying to avoid, the perception that I need family connections to solve my problems. And it would leave the system unchanged. Major Morrison would face consequences because he harassed a general's daughter, not because harassment is wrong. The next victim without powerful family wouldn't have the same protection. General Parker nodded slowly. I see. You want institutional accountability, not personal intervention. Yes, sir. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the base. What you're describing, the harassment, the retaliation, the abuse of authority, it's everything I've spent my career fighting against. But you need to understand something, Lieutenant. This won't be easy. Even with this evidence, Major Morrison will have defenders. Colonel Thompson will likely use his influence to protect his son-in-law. There will be people who question your motives, your reliability, your fitness for service. I understand, sir. Do you? He turned to face me. Because once this investigation starts, there's no going back. Your identity as the complainant will eventually become known. Some will see you as courageous. Others will see you as a troublemaker. Your career trajectory will be affected, regardless of the outcome. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Sarah Williams. I thought about the captain whose career had been destroyed at Morrison's previous command. I thought about every service member who would come after me. Yes, sir. I'm prepared. General Parker returned to his desk and picked up his phone. Get me the Inspector General's office and the Staff Judge Advocate. I need them both here within the hour. He hung up and looked at me. Lieutenant, I'm initiating a formal investigation. You'll need to provide your statement to the IG investigators. They'll interview witnesses, review the evidence, and make recommendations. This process will take time, probably several weeks at minimum. During that time, I'm going to have you temporarily reassigned to my headquarters staff to ensure Major Morrison can't retaliate further. Are you comfortable with that arrangement? Yes, sir. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. We haven't reached the end of this road. We hope you're finding this story compelling and thought-provoking. The investigation moved swiftly. The Inspector General assigned 2 investigators who interviewed me extensively, collected my evidence, and began interviewing other personnel. Within a week, they discovered something I hadn't known. I wasn't Major Morrison's only victim. Captain Jessica Martinez, who'd served in the same unit 2 years earlier, came forward when she learned about the investigation. She'd experienced similar harassment from Major Morrison, but had never reported it, fearing retaliation. Then Lieutenant Sarah Bradley spoke up. She was currently serving in a different battalion, but had worked directly for Major Morrison 18 months ago. She too had faced unwanted advances and retaliation when she refused. With 3 victims presenting consistent accounts, along with documentary and audio evidence, the case became increasingly difficult to dismiss. But as General Parker had warned, Major Morrison didn't go quietly. Colonel Thompson made his presence felt immediately. He called General Parker directly, suggesting that the allegations were exaggerated, that Major Morrison was the victim of a vindictive subordinate with a grudge. General Parker, to his credit, didn't waver. "The investigation will proceed according to regulations," he told Colonel Thompson. "If Major Morrison is innocent, the evidence will show that. But I won't interfere with a legitimate inquiry." Major Morrison himself went on the offensive, claiming that I had misinterpreted professional mentorship as harassment, that my poor performance reviews were justified and unrelated to any personal conflict, and that the recording had been taken out of context. His defense fell apart during the formal interrogation by the Inspector General's investigators. When presented with the testimonies from multiple victims, the pattern of behavior became undeniable. When confronted with the audio recording in its full context, his claims of misinterpretation lost credibility. 3 weeks into the investigation, the Inspector General submitted preliminary findings recommending that Major Morrison be charged under the Uniform Code of Military Justice with sexual harassment, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. General Parker convened an Article 32 hearing, essentially a military grand jury, to determine whether the evidence warranted a court-martial. I testified, as did the other victims. Character witnesses spoke on behalf of Major Morrison, describing him as a dedicated officer whose career shouldn't be destroyed over misunderstandings. But the evidence was overwhelming. The hearing officer recommended that charges proceed to a general court-martial. The trial took place 2 months after I'd first entered General Parker's office. It was held in the base's military courtroom, presided over by a military judge with a jury panel composed of senior officers from other commands. Major Morrison's defense attorney argued that the relationships had been consensual, that the performance criticisms were legitimate, and that I had fabricated the harassment claims because I couldn't meet professional standards. The prosecution systematically dismantled each argument. They presented the audio recording, which clearly showed Major Morrison threatening retaliation and explicitly linking favorable treatment to sexual cooperation. They presented testimony from all 3 victims, showing a pattern of predatory behavior. They brought in expert witnesses who analyzed the performance reviews and demonstrated that the criticisms were unsupported by objective data. Captain Foster, the legal assistance attorney who'd first advised me, testified about the documentation I'd compiled evidence that showed deliberate and systematic retaliation for rejecting sexual advances. The trial lasted 5 days. On the afternoon of the 5th day, the jury panel retired to deliberate. 3 hours later, they returned with their verdict guilty on all charges. Major Morrison showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but his wife, Colonel Thompson's daughter, sat in the gallery with tears streaming down her face. Sentencing came a week later. Major Morrison received a dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and 6 months' confinement in a military prison. His military career was over. His pension was revoked. His life, as he'd known it, had ended. Some people might have expected me to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and sadness. Relief that justice had been served. exhaustion from the ordeal, sadness that such accountability had been necessary at all. But there was also satisfaction, a deep sense that I'd done the right thing, not just for myself, but for Sarah Williams's memory, for the victims who'd been too frightened to speak up, and for every future service member who would hopefully benefit from a slightly improved system. General Parker called me to his office the day after sentencing. "You did well, Lieutenant," he said. "That took tremendous courage." "Thank you, sir. But I want you to understand something. This case succeeded because the evidence was irrefutable and because I was willing to support a fair investigation. That's not always the case. The system still has significant flaws. I know, sir, which is why I'm creating a new position, Victim Advocate Coordinator, for this division. The role will involve training, support for harassment and assault victims, and ensuring fair investigation procedures. I'd like you to take that position." I was stunned. "Sir, I'm a junior officer. Surely someone with more experience. You have the most important qualification. You understand what victims face because you've been through it. You'll have training and support, of course, but you have credibility that no one else can match. Will you accept?" I thought about it for only a moment. This was an opportunity to turn my painful experience into something constructive, to help ensure that other victims wouldn't face the same obstacles I had. "Yes, sir. I accept." Taking on the role of Victim Advocate Coordinator was both rewarding and challenging. General Parker had given me significant authority to reform how our division handled harassment and assault cases, but changing institutional culture required more than just new policies. The first weeks were overwhelming. I worked with the legal office to develop new reporting procedures that allowed victims to bypass their direct chain of command. When the accused was in their supervisory line, we established a confidential hotline where service members could report concerns anonymously. We brought in civilian experts to train investigators on trauma-informed interview techniques. But policy changes, I quickly learned, were the easy part. Changing attitudes was far more difficult. During my first training session for company level, leaders, captains, and senior sergeants who had direct leadership responsibility for soldiers, I encountered significant resistance. "With all due respect, ma'am," said Captain Robert Hughes, a company commander with 12 years of service, "aren't we creating a system where any disgruntled soldier can make false accusations and destroy a good officer's career?" It was a question I'd expected, though it still stung. "Captain, false accusations are extremely rare," I responded. "Studies show that only about 2 to 5% of reported cases are fabricated. In contrast, experts estimate that over 60% of actual harassment and assaults go unreported because victims fear retaliation or don't trust the system. We should be more concerned about the cases we never hear about than about the rare false accusation." "But Major Morrison's career is ruined," he persisted. What if he was telling the truth? Major Morrison was convicted by a jury of his peers after a fair trial, where he had legal representation and the opportunity to present his defense. The evidence against him included audio recordings of him explicitly threatening retaliation and propositioning subordinates. That's not a false accusation, that's accountability. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, who'd been promoted and was now assisting with the training program, added her perspective. "I've been in the military for 22 years. I've seen good leaders who maintain professional boundaries and treat everyone with respect. I've also seen predators who abuse their authority. The difference is clear to those paying attention. This isn't about destroying careers unfairly. It's about protecting the vast majority of good service members from the small minority of bad actors. Not everyone was convinced, but I could see some officers and NCOs nodding thoughtfully. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but seeds were being planted. The real impact became evident when victims started using the new reporting system. Within the first 3 months, we received 47 reports of harassment or assault, 47 cases that likely would have gone unreported under the old system. Each case was heartbreaking in its own way, but also represented a kind of hope. These service members trusted the system enough to come forward. That trust was a responsibility I took seriously. One case particularly stayed with me. Specialist Amy Richardson, a 22-year-old medic, reported that her squad leader, Staff Sergeant Marcus Powell, had been making increasingly inappropriate comments and had touched her inappropriately during a training exercise. When I met with Specialist Richardson, she was terrified. "He said no one would believe me," she told me, her hands shaking. "He said I'd be kicked out for making trouble." "I believe you," I said, "and we're going to investigate this thoroughly. You won't face retaliation, I'll make sure of that." The investigation confirmed her account. 2 other female soldiers in the same squad had witnessed Staff Sergeant Powell's inappropriate behavior, but had been too frightened to report it. Powell was removed from his leadership position, faced non-judicial punishment, and was transferred out of the unit. After the case was resolved, Specialist Richardson came to my office. "Thank you, ma'am," she said. "I thought my career was over. I thought no one would care. But you believed me, and you helped me. That means everything." Cases like Richardson's made the difficult work worthwhile. But not every case had a clear outcome, and that was frustrating. Corporal Michael Stevens reported that his supervisor, Lieutenant Daniel Warren, had been creating a hostile work environment with derogatory comments and favoritism. The investigation found evidence of unprofessional behavior, but nothing that rose to the level of actionable harassment under military regulations. Lieutenant Warren received counseling and a formal reprimand, but many felt that wasn't enough. "The system still protects officers," Corporal Stevens said bitterly after learning the outcome. "They can make our lives miserable, and as long as they're careful about it, nothing really happens." He wasn't entirely wrong. There were still significant gaps in the system, particularly in cases of hostile work environment harassment that didn't involve sexual misconduct or explicit discrimination. Those cases often fell into a gray area, where the behavior was clearly wrong but difficult to prosecute. I brought these concerns to General Parker. "Sir, we've made progress on sexual harassment cases, but we're still struggling with more subtle forms of leadership abuse." "You're right," he acknowledged, "but changing that requires more than division-level policy. It requires cultural change throughout the military, and that's a much longer-term project. So what do we do in the meantime? We keep documenting problems. We keep refining procedures. We keep advocating for victims. And we accept that change happens incrementally, not all at once." It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was realistic. 6 months into my role as Victim Advocate Coordinator, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from Colonel Patricia Daniels, who worked at the Pentagon in the office responsible for military personnel policy. "Lieutenant, I've been following the reforms in your division," she said. "General Parker has been sharing your work with senior leadership. We're impressed with what you've accomplished." "Thank you, ma'am. We'd like to implement similar programs across the entire service. Would you be willing to come to the Pentagon for a temporary assignment to help develop service-wide policy?" I was stunned. Going to the Pentagon as a lieutenant was almost unheard of. It was an incredible professional opportunity. May I have some time to consider, ma'am? Of course. Discuss it with General Parker and let me know within a week. After hanging up, I sat in my office feeling overwhelmed. This was everything I could have hoped for, a chance to effect change at the highest levels, to turn my personal experience into institutional reform. But I also thought about the service members in our division who had just started to trust the new system. If I left now, would they feel abandoned? Would the reforms continue without me to advocate for them? I shared my dilemma with Sergeant Rodriguez over coffee that evening. Ma'am, you can't stay in one place forever out of guilt, she said. You've built a strong foundation here. The system will continue. But if you go to the Pentagon, you can help create change across the entire military. That's a bigger impact than staying in one division. But what if the program falls apart without me? Then it wasn't a good program to begin with. She smiled gently. Real institutional change doesn't depend on one person. You've trained others. You've created procedures. You've changed minds. That work continues whether you're here or not. She was right, though it was hard to accept. The next day, I spoke with General Parker. Sir, Colonel Daniels offered me a Pentagon assignment to help develop service-wide victim advocacy policy. I know. I recommended you for it. That surprised me. You did, sir? You've done exceptional work here, Lieutenant. But this division isn't the only place that needs reform. The Pentagon assignment will give you a platform to influence policy across the entire service. That's where you can do the most good. I'm worried about leaving the program here. The program will be fine. Captain Martinez has agreed to take over as Victim Advocate Coordinator. She's been working closely with you, she understands the mission, and she's a capable officer. More importantly, the reforms you've implemented are now official division policy. They'll continue regardless of personnel changes. Captain Martinez was indeed capable. She'd been one of Major Morrison's victims, who'd come forward during the investigation, and she was passionate about the mission. When would I leave? I asked. 2 months. That gives you time to transition responsibilities and ensures continuity. I spent those 2 months training Captain Martinez and documenting everything I'd learned. We met daily to discuss cases, procedures, and the nuances of victim advocacy that couldn't be captured in written policy. On my last day at the division, several service members who'd been helped by the victim advocacy program organized a small farewell gathering. Specialist Richardson, whose case against Staff Sergeant Powell had been one of my first, spoke on behalf of the group. Ma'am, you changed things here, she said. Before you, a lot of us felt like we had no voice, that the system didn't care about us. You showed us that speaking up matters, that the truth matters, and that justice is possible. We're all better off because you had the courage to stand up for yourself and then use that experience to help others. Thank you. I had to fight back tears. These were the moments that made everything worthwhile, knowing that the painful experience with Major Morrison had been transformed into something constructive. General Parker also attended the gathering. At the end, he pulled me aside. Your father would be proud, he said. Hell, I'm proud. You've accomplished more as a lieutenant than many officers do in entire careers. Thank you, sir, for everything, for believing me, for supporting the investigation, for giving me the opportunity to make a difference. You made the difference, Lieutenant. I just made sure the system didn't get in your way. The Pentagon was overwhelming at first. The building itself was massive, a city within a city, with its own complex culture and politics. As a lieutenant working in high-level policy, I was the most junior person in most meetings, often the only person in the room not wearing field grade or general officer rank. But Colonel Daniels had assembled a team specifically to reform how the military handled harassment and assault cases, and my practical experience made me valuable despite my rank. Most people in this building have never actually worked as a victim advocate, Colonel Daniels told me during my first week. They understand policy in theory, but not in practice. You understand what victims actually need, what obstacles they face, and what works. That perspective is invaluable. The team spent 6 months developing comprehensive reforms. We proposed new reporting procedures, mandatory training requirements, independent investigation processes, and accountability measures for commanders who failed to take appropriate action. The proposed reforms faced significant resistance from some senior leaders who viewed them as unnecessary or as undermining commander authority. We briefed generals, attended congressional staff meetings, and revised our proposals countless times based on feedback. During one particularly contentious meeting, a two-star general challenged the reforms directly. These proposals assume commanders can't be trusted to handle these issues appropriately, he said. That's insulting to the officer corps. I'd been quiet through most of the meeting, conscious of my junior rank, but Colonel Daniels gestured for me to respond. Sir, with respect, the reforms don't assume commanders are untrustworthy, I said. They acknowledge that some commanders have personal relationships or institutional pressures that can affect their judgment. Creating independent reporting and investigation options doesn't undermine good. Commanders, it protects them by ensuring allegations are investigated fairly and thoroughly. Good commanders should welcome these reforms because they protect everyone involved. The general studied me for a moment. You're the lieutenant from General Parker's division, aren't you? The Morrison case? Yes, sir. You have personal experience with commanders failing to act appropriately? I have personal experience with not trusting the chain of command to act appropriately because the alleged perpetrator had family connections to senior officers in that chain. The independent reporting option would have allowed me to come forward sooner, which could have prevented other victims from being harmed. He nodded slowly. Point taken, Lieutenant. Not everyone was convinced, but having that personal narrative, being able to speak from experience rather than theory, carried weight in policy debates. After 8 months of development and advocacy, the reforms were officially adopted as Department of Defense policy. Every military service would be required to implement independent reporting options, specialized victim advocates, and enhanced training for investigators. It was a significant victory, but I knew implementation would be the real challenge. Policy on paper didn't automatically translate to cultural change. Colonel Daniels must have been thinking the same thing. These reforms are just the beginning, she said at our team meeting after the policy was announced. The hard work is ensuring they're actually implemented and enforced. That's going to take years. She was right. Over the next year, I traveled to military installations across the country, helping commands implement the new policies, training victim advocates, and troubleshooting problems. At one base, I met with a group of female officers who were skeptical about whether the reforms would make a real difference. We've seen policy changes before, said a captain. They look good on paper, but nothing really changes. The culture stays the same. You're right that policy alone doesn't change culture, I acknowledged, but it creates accountability mechanisms that make cultural change possible. The Morrison case at my division wasn't resolved because Major Morrison suddenly developed a conscience. It was resolved because General Parker enforced existing policies and held a senior officer accountable. Good policy gives good leaders the tools they need to enforce standards. But what about bad leaders? Another officer asked. What about commanders who don't want to enforce these policies? That's where accountability comes in. Under the new policy, if a commander fails to properly report or investigate an allegation, they face their own disciplinary action. It's not perfect, but it's better than what we had before. These conversations happened at base after base. Some service members were hopeful, others were cynical. All had been affected in some way by the military's historical failures to address harassment and assault appropriately. During one visit to a base in Texas, I met a senior enlisted woman who'd served for 28 years. Sergeant Major Patricia Williams pulled me aside after a training session. "Ma'am, can I tell you something?" "Of course, Sergeant Major." 30 years ago, when I was a young private, I was sexually assaulted by a senior NCO. I reported it, and nothing happened. The investigation was a joke. My command treated me like I was the problem. I almost left the military because of it. I'm so sorry that happened to you. What I want to say is this: I stayed because I loved the mission, and because I hoped things would eventually get better. I've watched reform efforts come and go, and honestly, I didn't believe this one would be different. But seeing you here, seeing someone who fought back and won, and then used that experience to change the system, it gives me hope that maybe, finally, things are actually changing. Her words stayed with me. This work wasn't just about policy. It was about giving hope to people who'd been failed by the system, showing them that change was possible, and honoring the sacrifices of those who'd come before. 2 years after the Morrison case, I was promoted to captain. My assignment at the Pentagon was coming to an end, and I was being reassigned to a field command and a company leadership position where I'd have direct responsibility for soldiers. Before leaving, Colonel Daniels asked me to speak at a Pentagon briefing for new victim advocates from across all services. There were about 50 people in the audience, officers and NCOs, who'd been selected to implement the new programs at their installations. "I want to tell you about my mentor, Sarah Williams," I began. "She was a few years ahead of me at the academy. She taught me about integrity, about standing up for what's right, and about being a leader who puts principles before personal advancement." After graduation, Sarah was assigned to her first duty station, where she was sexually harassed by a senior officer. She reported it. The system failed her. The investigation went nowhere. She faced retaliation. 3 months later, she took her own life. The room was completely silent. I think about Sarah often, especially when this work gets difficult. I wonder what would have happened if the system that failed her had been different, if reporting procedures had protected her from retaliation, if the investigation had been impartial and thorough, if her command had prioritized her safety and dignity over protecting a senior officer. I paused, emotion rising in my throat. We can't change what happened to Sarah, but we can honor her memory by ensuring the system that failed her is better for the next generation. That's why you're here. You're not just implementing policy. You're saving lives. You're giving hope to service members who've been victimized. You're showing that the military is capable of accountability and justice. After the briefing, several people approached me. One young captain, recently selected as a victim advocate, said, "Thank you for sharing that. It's easy to get lost in procedures and paperwork and forget that real people are depending on us." I needed that reminder. That evening, I visited Arlington National Cemetery. I'd learned that Sarah Williams was buried there. Her family had requested military honors despite the circumstances of her death. I found her grave in Section 60, where many veterans of the recent wars were laid to rest. The headstone was simple, bearing her name, rank, and years of service. I knelt beside the grave and placed flowers on the stone. I hope you know what you meant to me, I said quietly. You taught me to be strong, to stand on my own merit, to fight for what's right. I wish you could see what's changing. It's not perfect. There's still so much work to do, but it's better than it was. And it's better because of people like you who deserved better from the system. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cemetery. I thought about all the service members buried here, all the sacrifices that had been made, all the battles that had been fought, not just on foreign soil, but within our own institutions. I promise to keep fighting, I said. For you! For everyone who's been failed. For everyone who will come after us. A breeze rustled through the trees, and I chose to interpret it as Sarah's acknowledgement. 3 months later, I took command of Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment. Standing before my company for the first time, 120 soldiers who would be my responsibility, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. I'd started my career trying to avoid my father's shadow, trying to prove myself on my own merit. I'd faced harassment and retaliation from a predatory officer. I'd fought back, despite the personal cost, because silence would have been a greater betrayal. And I'd spent 2 years working to reform the system so others wouldn't face the same obstacles. Now, I was a company commander, responsible not just for my own conduct, but for creating a command climate where every soldier felt safe, valued, and respected. During my first meeting with my leadership team, platoon leaders, and senior NCOs, I addressed the issue directly. I wanted to be clear about my expectations, I said. We will maintain the highest professional standards. Sexual harassment, assault, discrimination, or abuse of authority will not be tolerated, not just because regulations prohibit them, but because they're fundamentally incompatible with good leadership and unit cohesion. My first sergeant, Master Sergeant James Thompson, nodded approvingly. Ma'am, I've served under commanders who talked about standards but didn't enforce them. How do we know you're different? It was a fair question, and I appreciated his directness, because I've experienced what happens when leaders fail to enforce standards, I said. Early in my career, I was sexually harassed by a senior officer. When I refused his advances, he retaliated against me professionally. I reported it, and thanks to a commanding general who took the allegations seriously, the officer was held accountable. But it shouldn't have taken a 2-star general's intervention for the system to work properly. The room was quiet. Several of my leaders looked surprised. Commanders rarely shared such personal information. I tell you this not for sympathy, but so you understand where I'm coming from. I know what it's like to feel powerless, to worry that reporting wrongdoing will destroy your career, to wonder if anyone in authority actually cares. I don't want any soldier in this company to ever feel that way. If someone comes to you with a concern, any concern, take it seriously. If you're not sure how to handle it, come to me. If the concern involves me, go to the battalion commander. But never ever brush off a soldier's concern or tell them to handle it on their own. Master Sergeant Thompson spoke again. Roger that, ma'am. We'll make sure everyone knows the standards and knows they can report problems without fear. Over the following months, I worked to build a command climate based on trust, respect, and accountability. It wasn't always easy. There were discipline problems, personality conflicts, and the usual challenges of military leadership. But by consistently enforcing standards and demonstrating that every soldier's dignity mattered, we built a strong unit culture. 6 months into my command, a young private came to my office to report that a squad leader had been making inappropriate comments. I listened carefully, took the report seriously, and ensured the matter was investigated thoroughly. The squad leader was found to have violated standards and was removed from his leadership position. After the case was resolved, the private came back to my office. "Ma'am, thank you for believing me," he said. "I was scared to report it. I thought it might make things worse. But you took me seriously, and the system worked." "That's how it should work," I replied. "Always." "Can I ask you something, ma'am?" "Of course." "Why did you tell us about what happened to you?" "Commanders usually don't share personal stuff like that." I thought about how to answer. "Because I want you to know that even officers face these issues, that it's not a sign of weakness to report problems, and that I understand what you're going through because I've been there myself. If sharing my experience helps even one soldier feel comfortable coming forward, it's worth it." He nodded thoughtfully. "It helps, ma'am." It really does. 5 years after the Morrison case, I was promoted to major and reassigned to division staff. My father, now a 3-star general, called to congratulate me. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Not just for the promotion, but for how you've handled your career. You've made a real difference." "Thanks, Dad." It felt strange calling him that. In the context of military service usually, we maintained formal military relationships when discussing our careers. "I heard about your company command. Your battalion commander gave you top marks. He said you built one of the best command climates he's ever seen. I had good people working with me." "No, you set the tone. That's what leadership is." He paused. "You know, when you first told me you wanted to serve under your mother's name, to build your career without using my position, I was hurt. I thought you were rejecting me." "I wasn't." "I know that now. You were establishing your own identity, proving yourself on your own merits, and you've succeeded beyond what I could have hoped. You didn't need my help or my name. You built your career on your own competence and character." "I learned from watching you," I said. "You taught me about integrity and duty, even if you never said it directly." When General Parker took over my division and I brought him the evidence against Morrison, he told me you two had served together. "He said you were a good officer." That meant something to me, knowing that the general willing to fight for justice had learned some of that from working with you. "James Parker and I did serve together. He was a captain when I was a major. Good man. I'm glad he was there when you needed support." We talked for a while longer, bridging some of the distance that had always existed between us. The military had brought us together and kept us apart in equal measure. But now, finally, we'd found a way to connect as both family and fellow officers. That conversation meant more to me than the promotion. 10 years after the Morrison case, I was a lieutenant colonel serving on the Army staff, working on personnel policy. The reforms we'd implemented a decade earlier had become standard practice, accepted as the normal way of doing business by officers who'd never known the old system. There were still problems, still cases that fell through the cracks, still commanders who didn't take allegations seriously enough, but the overall trajectory was positive. Reporting rates were up, which paradoxically was a good sign. It meant victims trusted the system enough to come forward. Conviction rates for substantiated cases were higher. Retaliation against reporters was declining. The cultural change was happening, slowly but steadily. I received an email one day from Specialist Richardson, whom I'd helped during my time as victim advocate coordinator. She was now a sergeant, still serving, with plans to make the military a career. "Ma'am, I wanted to update you on my life," she wrote. "I'm doing well. I love my job. I'm mentoring younger soldiers and helping them understand that they have rights and that the system will protect them if they report problems. I'm living proof that you can report harassment and still have a successful career. Thank you for showing me that. Messages like that made every difficult moment worthwhile. I also heard from Captain Martinez, who'd taken over the victim advocacy program after I left. She was now a major and had been selected to command a battalion, a significant achievement that demonstrated victim advocates weren't career dead ends. The program continues to grow, she wrote. We've helped hundreds of soldiers over the years. The system isn't perfect, but it's so much better than it was. Thank you for starting this. But the message that affected me most came from someone I'd never met. Her name was Lieutenant Emily Foster, and she was serving in a different division. "Colonel, you don't know me," her email began, "but I want to thank you. 3 months ago, I was sexually harassed by a senior officer. I reported it immediately using the independent reporting system you helped create. The investigation was fair and thorough. The officer was held accountable. I didn't face retaliation. My career is intact. I understand that you went through something similar early in your career, and that your experience helped create the system that protected me. Thank you for fighting that battle, so I didn't have to face the same obstacles you did." I sat at my desk, reading that email several times. This was the legacy I'd hoped for, a system where victims could report abuse without fear, where justice was possible, where one person's trauma could be transformed into protection for others. I thought about Sarah Williams, whose death had haunted me for so many years. The system had failed her, but perhaps her memory had helped save Emily Foster and countless others. That evening, I returned to Arlington National Cemetery. It had been years since my last visit to Sarah's grave, but I felt compelled to go. The cemetery was quieter on a weekday evening. I found Sarah's grave and knelt beside it, just as I had a decade earlier. "I have good news," I told her. "The system is working. Not perfectly, but better. People like Emily Foster can report harassment and get justice without sacrificing their careers. That's because of you, Sarah. Because your story mattered. Because I refused to let your death be meaningless. I placed fresh flowers on the grave. I'm not fighting this battle alone anymore. There are victim advocates at every installation, policies that protect reporters, commanders who take these issues seriously. The culture is changing. Slowly, but it's changing." The sun was setting again, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I thought about all the battles that had been fought, both literal and metaphorical, to bring us to this moment. "Rest easy, my friend," I said. "Your legacy lives on in every soldier who speaks up, every lead. The military I joined as a young lieutenant, the military that had enabled Morrison's predatory behavior and failed to protect Sarah, was changing. Not because of any single person or policy, but because enough people had decided that the status quo was unacceptable. Change was possible. Justice was possible. And sometimes the courage to speak one truth could echo across years and miles, protecting people you'd never meet, creating ripples that spread far beyond what you could see. That was the legacy I wanted to leave, not just my own story of survival and advocacy, but a system that made such advocacy less necessary because it protected people before harm occurred. As I drove away from Arlington, I made myself a promise I would continue this work for as long as I wore the uniform. For Sarah, for Emily, for every service member who deserved better. And I would trust that others would carry it forward when my time came to pass the torch. Because that's what legacy means, not what you accomplish yourself, but what continues after you're gone.